There's a ship that never sank, but perhaps never existed. There's a hero who is perhaps two heroes. There's an object that is preserved with so much care that it is no longer the object that was being preserved. And there is a question that starts with rotting wood and ends with you looking in the mirror, wondering if the person you see there is the same person who walked into the bathroom 5 minutes ago, the same person who woke up this morning, the same person who was born decades ago with a name someone chose for a creature they still had no idea who it was. The Ship of Theseus paradox is one of the oldest in philosophy, but its apparent simplicity is a trap. Because the question he asks, what makes a thing itself over time, is not a question about ships. It's the question behind all other questions about identity. It is the problem that is silently present in every legal decision about criminal responsibility, in every discussion about whether a nation should honor the commitments of a previous government, in every medical question about when a patient with advanced dementia is still the same person who signed a document years before. It's there when you look at a childhood photograph and feel something strange when you realize that that child is you, but you can't completely believe it. The original story is known. Theseus returned from Crete having killed the Minotaur, and the Athenians preserved his ship as a monument to his deed. Plutarch, who lived in the 1st century of the Common Era, recorded that this ship was kept in Athens for such a long time that the wooden planks gradually rotted and were replaced one by one with new planks, and that this situation had become an example that philosophers used when debating the problem of identity and persistence. Was this ship still the same ship as Theseus, or had it become something different throughout the process of replacement? So far, the problem seems to have a reasonably clear structure, even if the answer is not obvious. But it was Thomas Hobbes, the 17th century English political philosopher, who added the complication that turns the puzzle into something truly devastating. Hobbes wondered, what if someone had saved each replaced board? What if, at the end of the complete replacement process, this person had rebuilt the original ship using all of the original planks in their original position and arrangement? Now there would be two ships. The ship in the port of Athens, which has never stopped being called the Ship of Theseus, which has maintained historical and functional continuity, but which has no original parts. And the rebuilt ship, which has all the original parts in the original layout, but which was dismantled and stored for an indefinite period. Which of the two is the real Ship of Theseus? This question seems to have an answer. But when you try to formulate the answer precisely, you realize that any answer you give implies an identity criterion that produces absurd consequences when applied to other cases. If you say that the ship in the harbor is the real one because it maintained historical continuity and never stopped existing like the Ship of Theseus, then you are saying that identity is a matter of continuity of function and social role, not of material composition. But then a completely different ship that gradually takes on the role of the Ship of Theseus in Athenian culture would eventually be the Ship of Theseus, which seems absurd. If you say that the reconstructed ship is the real one because it is made of the original material, then you are saying that identity is a matter of material composition. But then, every time you lose cells in your body and replace them with new ones, you gradually become a different person until at some point you stop being you, which also seems absurd. There's a third way that a lot of people try, saying that they both have some right to identity with the original Ship of Theseus, but neither has a full right. The original identity was divided or distributed between the two. But this response faces the problem that identity is typically treated as a relationship that does not admit of degrees or divisions. One thing is either identical to another, or it is not. If we admit that it can be partially identical, we need a completely new theory of what identity means, and such a theory does not yet exist in a satisfactory form. This would not necessarily be a serious philosophical problem if identity were just a theoretical question with no practical consequences. But it's not. The question of when something stays the same and when it becomes different has profound legal, moral, and political implications that constantly appear in real life. Consider contract law. A company that signs a contract in 2010 is still bound by the contract in 2024. If all of the original directors left, the shareholders are completely different, the company's main product has changed, the headquarters has changed countries, and the name has been changed. Courts need to answer this question, and the different possible answers have enormous financial consequences. The law uses the concept of a legal entity, a legal fiction that assigns persistent identity to organizations so that they can have rights and obligations over time. But this legal fiction does not solve the philosophical problem. She just conveniently ignores him. Consider historical responsibility. Is contemporary Germany responsible for the debts and reparations for the crimes of the Nazi regime? Most people say yes, based on some idea of national continuity. But today's Germany does not have the same leaders, the same form of government, the same inhabitants, and in many fundamental respects, it represents a radical break with the regime that existed between 1933 and 1945. In what sense is it the same nation? And if you say it's the same nation for the purposes of historical accountability, you need a criterion of national identity that will likely have implications you didn't anticipate in other contexts. But it is when the paradox turns to personal identity that it becomes genuinely disturbing in a way that is not just intellectual, because you are not just a spectator of this problem, you are the problem. The human body is in a process of constant material replacement. Different cell types have different renewal rates. Red blood cells live on average 120 days. The cells in the lining of the intestine renew themselves every few days. Liver cells last between 1 and 2 years. The neurons of the cerebral cortex are largely the same throughout life, but even they change the molecules that make them up continually. Estimates vary, but there's a real sense in which most of the atoms that make up your body today were not in your body 7 years ago. Materially, you are an entity in continuous flux, more like a river than a stone. This would not be philosophically problematic if identity were just a matter of matter. But the most influential philosophical tradition on personal identity does not say that it is. John Locke, the 17th century English philosopher, proposed that what makes you the same person over time is the continuity of consciousness, and especially memory. You are the same person you were as a child because there is a chain of connected memories that runs from the present to the past. You remember yesterday, and yesterday you remember the day before yesterday, and so on, forming a chain that connects the you of now to the you of years or decades ago. Locke's theory seemed to elegantly solve the problem. It explained why personal identity was different from bodily identity, why a being with total amnesia could arguably be a different person, why we care about our future in a way that we don't care about strangers. But the Scottish philosopher Thomas Reid in the 18th century created a counterexample that became famous precisely for showing that Locke's theory had a fundamental logical defect. Reid imagined a young man who was publicly flogged as punishment for stealing fruit from an orchard. Later, as a young officer, the same man was awarded for bravery on the battlefield, and at that time he still vividly remembered the childhood flogging. Even later, as an elderly and respected general, he clearly remembered the battle from when he was a young officer, but the memory of the flogging had completely disappeared. Locke's theory says that the young officer is the same person as the whipped boy because he can remember the whipping. He says the general is the same person as the young officer because he can remember the battle. But then the general should be the same person as the flogged boy because identity is transitive. If A is the same as B and B is the same as C, then A is the same as C. But the general cannot remember the whipping, so by Locke's theory, he is not the same person as the boy. Contradiction. The most common solution to Reid's paradox is to modify Locke's theory to include not just direct memories, but chains of overlapping memories, like the chain described above. You don't have to directly remember every event from your past to be the same person. You just need there to be a continuous chain of memory overlaps that connects the present to the past. The general remembers the battle, and when he was a young officer, he remembered the flogging, and that is enough to make them all the same person. This modification seems reasonable, but it opens up another problem. Memory chains can form in nonlinear, branching, or interrupted ways that simple theory cannot accommodate. And more fundamentally, memory is notorious, unreliable mind. People build false memories. People are encouraged to remember things that didn't happen. People reinterpret past memories in light of present narratives to the point where the memory becomes something radically different from the original event. If personal identity depends on memory, and memory is this fluid, constructed thing, then personal identity is much more unstable than we usually assume. The philosopher Derek Parfit went furthest in this direction, and the conclusions he reached are among the most disturbing that philosophy has ever produced on any issue. Parfit developed a series of thought experiments that are direct descendants of the Ship of Theseus paradox, but applied to personal identity, and which were designed to show that personal identity is not what matters, and that perhaps the self that we assume exists does not exist in the way we think. One of Parfit's thought experiments involves what he called teleportation. Imagine a machine scanning your body and brain with molecular perfection, destroying the original and reconstructing an exact copy elsewhere. The copy has all your memories, all your personality, all your character. She believes it's you. In what sense did you survive? Most people, when they think about it carefully, feel that it is not, that what arrived on the other side is a copy, even if it is a perfect copy, and that you died in the process of destroying the original. But now suppose that the machine has a defect. It reconstructs the copy but does not destroy the original. Now there are two people who believe they are you, with the same memories, the same personality, the same character. Both have exactly the same relationship with their story, Which one are you? The obvious answer is that you are the original, because it has physical continuity and has never been destroyed. But what if the machine destroys the original just 5 minutes after creating the copy, due to a technical failure? Did you survive those 5 minutes and then die? Or is the copy that remains you? If you say it is the copy, then physical continuity is not what matters, because the copy never had physical continuity with the original. If you say that you died along with the original, then the existence of an entity with all its psychological characteristics is not sufficient for its survival. Parfit concluded that these experiments reveal that personal identity is not an all-or-nothing question, and that the question of whether a person survived or not may not have a determinate answer in certain cases. More radically, he argued that the self we assume exists, a persistent and unified subject that has experiences over time, is a convenient fiction, but not a fundamental metaphysical reality. What exists are connected physical and psychological processes, and the question of whether these processes constitute the same person over time is less important than we generally assume. This conclusion has consequences that Parfit explored with admirable intellectual honesty. If the self is less real than we assume, then rational selfishness, the idea that each person has special reason to prioritize their own future well-being above the well-being of others, loses much of its foundation. The future version of you 30 years from now is so different from you today that it might not be much closer to you than anyone else. Why should you sacrifice yourself today to benefit this future being any more than you should sacrifice yourself to benefit a stranger? This conclusion resonates in surprising ways with completely different philosophical traditions. Buddhism has for 2.5 millennia taught that the self is a construct, that there is no separate, permanent entity that you call yourself, and that human suffering is largely rooted in attachment to this fiction. What Parfit arrived at through logical analysis of thought experiments on teleportation, Buddhism arrived at through contemplative analysis of direct experience. The convergence is impressive and suggestive, even though the two projects are completely different in method and context. But there's one objection that needs to be taken seriously. When Parfit says that the self is a fiction, he is not saying that nothing exists. There are physical processes, there are psychological states, there are memories and preferences and projects. What he is asking is whether there is something beyond all this, an additional subject who has these experiences, in addition to the experiences themselves. And here the question becomes genuinely difficult, because when you look inside trying to find the subject beyond the experiences, you only find more experiences. There is no hidden self behind the experience. There is only experience. But then, what is having the experience? This question, which is where the Ship of Theseus paradox meets the hard problem of consciousness, may be of the most genuine frontiers of philosophical thought. Not because we don't have answers, but because the available answers all seem too costly. Either you postulate a subject that you can never find when you look, or you deny the subject and need to explain to whom the experience is happening. What the Ship of Theseus reveals, when followed to its extremes, is that identity, whether of ships or people or nations, is not a simple, determinate property that things either have or do not have. It is a set of relationships, of continuities, of connections that exist in degrees, that are partially constituted by social practices and conventions, in addition to physical and psychological facts, and that become indeterminate in extreme cases not because there is a lack of information, but because the concept itself was not constructed to deal with these cases. This is not a nihilistic conclusion. It does not mean that identity does not exist, or that it is completely arbitrary. It means it's more complicated, more contextual, more interesting than our everyday language suggests, and that the deepest questions about who you are have no answers that can be given once and forgotten. These are questions that accompany each transformation, each loss, each crisis that makes you question whether the person on the other side is still the same person who entered. Sometimes the answer that matters most is not yes or no, but the quality of attention with which you follow the change.